Jared Kushner, the Paris Agreement, and U.S. reliability. I'm Heather Godwin, and this is the Square Circle.
If you have a passion for helping people, want to launch a new charity, or need to raise funds, Voluntary Solutions can help. You have a passion for helping people. We have a passion for helping you. Visit voluntarysolutionsdc.com, 844-739-5488.
Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Heather Godwin. Joining us today are Gregory Clay of gdclay.com, Leif Larson of Craft DC, and Daniel Marans of the Huffington Post. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
All right. Excited to have you all here.
Great to be here.
So the ongoing story involving Russia and the Trump campaign has now ensnared the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Here's the story from NBC News.
The White House tonight struggling to fend off questions about son-in-law Jared Kushner's contacts with Russia during the transition, after a wave of headlines that aides concede blindsided West Wing staff.
I'm not going to get into it, but your question presupposes facts that have not been confirmed.
Press Secretary Sean Spicer did not deny a Washington Post report that during Kushner's meeting last December at Trump Tower with Michael Flynn and Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, the 36-year-old proposed setting up secret back-channel communications with Moscow, using Russian diplomatic facilities for the talks.
Gregory Clay.
Yes.
Tell me, how do you think they can make this backroom business plausible to the public?
Well, first of all, one thing about Jared Kushner I want to know about. Has anyone ever heard the guy talk? Publicly. I've never heard the cat's voice. He's like Paris Hilton. You see them, but you don't hear them. Okay? And secondly, apparently he's in trouble because he's hanging out with two Russian cats named Sergei. Kislyak and Gorkov. Kislyak, of course, his chancellery is a block from my bus stop, and with the iron gates and everything. And he is involved in this quote-unquote back channel world, and apparently he was doing his back channel game after the election, during the transition period, before his father-in-law actually was president and not president-elect. Okay? So how do you sell that as the real deal? When he is supposedly, and I guess I should use the term allegedly, am I right?
Allegedly.
Okay.
That's a good term, yeah.
Last December, talking to two cats named Sergei, and is he doing this on the up and up? Or is he in violation of the Logan Act, similar to what Michael Flynn may have been doing? Are you really supposed to be talking to a foreign government as a private citizen? Because technically he wasn't, in the White House yet, and talking to a foreign government that is in dispute with the United States. How do you sell that? This whole back channel thing. It sounds like the son-in-law, which I take from the cover of the new issue of Time magazine. There's a great story on him, on the cover story, Time magazine, written by Carl Vick. It's about 1,500 words. How do you sell this as something that's above board, as opposed to something that may be a felony?
Leif Larson of Craft DC, what's your opinion?
Yes.
The use of story, I think fable would also be quite appropriate for most of what we're reading these days. Listen, I don't think anybody disputes the fact that he probably met with these two gentlemen.
Okay.
Met with the banker, he met with the Russian ambassador. Now, I don't think anybody disputes that he wanted to try to open up communications with Putin to put the relationship of the United States back on solid ground. John Kerry had attempted it, months before by having Henry Kissinger make a private call to Putin. At that time, President Obama put the squash on it because quite frankly, I think he had a personal grudge against Putin. He just didn't like him. He didn't want to do anything with him. He didn't want to go down that direction. I don't think there's anything wrong with Kushner trying to open up channels of communication. Where this thing goes completely off into a bad spy movie is the fact of a secret letter was sent to the Washington Post that they won't show anybody. What's in the letter? We don't know. Who wrote it? We don't know. Do they have it? We don't know, but they won't. They say they have it, but they won't show it. Then, according to the letter, Kushner asked if we could open up and use some of your secret communications devices so the U.S. intelligence community couldn't monitor our communications. After asking the ambassador that, can we have secret devices, in your console to communicate? We're to believe that the Russian ambassador, after being asked that, goes on a monitored channel that he knows the intelligence community of the United States is going to intercept and tells Moscow, hey, by the way, Jared Kushner wants to use our secret communications so nobody can monitor it.
Right.
What do you think of that idea?
Right.
This is completely, I don't know where you go with it. It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
If you believe, everybody says, oh, the Russians aren't to be trusted, but then the left wing says, but, listen to what they said. That was communications intercepted. The Russians are playing us
Big time.
so poorly,
Big time.
in such a way that they're getting what they wanted, which is complete, breakdown of our government system here,
Right.
with no evidence that anybody has done anything. They just keep leaking stories here and there, little intelligence. I wouldn't be surprised if that letter came from the Russians themselves to the Washington Post. So I think
Sort of a
this is
disinformation
all
campaign.
Disinformation, and this is all above board. I mean, transition teams have always had a little leeway in making communications and inroads to other governments.
Daniel Marans, what do you think?
The media have sometimes made mistakes in representing information that turned out not to be credible, but certainly everything that we know about the situation so far suggests that the Washington Post has acted with integrity. It is protected by the Constitution for media outlets, and that's been ruled on by the Supreme Court to publish classified information if they deem it newsworthy. And frankly, even if they do not, it is just simply a violation of ethics if it's potentially compromising of security and does not have news value. So I just want to clear that up because I saw you take a dig at my profession and my sector, but I want to move on from there just for a moment because I do see some nuance here that I think some of my colleagues on the left don't always see, and I'm willing to concede that. I just don't want the narrative then turned back around to the Washington Post. Keep in mind, the White House has not denied this. So in terms of questioning the integrity of the reporting, as you said, they haven't denied it. Or really challenged the veracity of the question of this security letter. Yes, there have been leaders in the past that have established back channels with foreign governments. And there have been intelligence officials in the past that have leaked classified information to the media for strategic reasons. Whether you think that's appropriate generally depends on the circumstance and what your view of the policy outcomes is. I think it's safe to say that Nixon doing that in 1968 to scuttle a peace deal in Vietnam that Johnson was negotiating probably was not a good thing for the country on the whole. Look, there have been many administrations that have tried to start on a new page with Russia. That's certainly not to be sort of scoffed at or dismissed. And I think that there is a danger here in getting whipped up into an anti-Russian frenzy that liberals have traditionally avoided. And at the same time, when we look at what Kushner has allegedly done in the context of a broader set of actions, which is that you have a number of officials that were close to the Trump campaign in particular, not necessarily the administration, though Mike Flynn being an exception there, who had conversations and are being investigated for the potential, and again, there's not yet evidence of it, but the potential of working with the Russian government in some capacity to influence the election itself. That's the relevant question. That's why people are so alarmed by all these stories that keep bubbling up.
You mentioned whipped up into an anti-Russian frenzy. That happened back in, I think, December. Now we're in a complete frothing movement of Russians. I mean, now we have a lot of people on the left who are in a very 1950s, Red Scare type of mode.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's
there's
no
a Russian
doubt.
mother every
There's
bed.
plenty of Russian frenzy going on.
Exactly.
In the
And a lot
country
depends
right
on
now
the
between us,
politics.
but
Yeah,
well, anyway, gentlemen, we need to move on now. So thank you. That was. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, and we'll answer as many questions as we can live on air toward the end of the show. Also this week, President Trump has decided to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate change. Here's CBS's coverage.
President Trump is telling people close to him that the United States will withdraw from the historic Paris Agreement on climate change. Major Garrett at the White House reports the president has also discussed renegotiating the plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with his senior staff.
The president refused a request to endorse the climate accord when he met with a group of 7 leaders last week. Former President Barack Obama helped negotiate this Paris deal. Opponents say the agreement would hurt American industries.
Okay, so Daniel Marans with Huffington Post, how do you think this will impact the U.S.?
Well, I think it'll impact the United States in the sense that it will impact the entire world by the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, and certainly over the course of the industrialized period that has created climate change, the United States not participating, joining only just Syria and Nicaragua, not participating in a non-binding, non-legally enforceable, voluntary global agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need to hit certain targets if we are going to avoid some of the worst effects of climate change. Now, the United States may have the resources to withstand that through mitigation in some ways. I don't really want to find out, particularly when we look at some of the targets way down the line and some of the ways that will affect our coastal communities. But the way this is going to affect developing countries is going to create global crisis after global crisis. And the fact of the matter is, if the United States wants the cooperation of other countries, not least the Europeans, our closest allies, in matters related to counterterrorism or economic cooperation, then that's just going to be that much harder now that we are joining the august company of Syria and Nicaragua and abdicating from this agreement. I'm concerned about the planet and about the human race, quite frankly, because I do take this very seriously.
And you notice that Donald Trump, in his speech on Thursday, tried to sell his idea, his plan, his decision with one word. What's that? The J word, jobs. You notice that? Everything's about jobs.
Well, this is all about...
Right. He's saying that...
This is supposed to be good for the U.S. economy.
Good for the United States economy, because it'll bring jobs back to the United States, et cetera, and won't go abroad. And he was trying to personalize it for people. I mean, you can see what he was doing. He also was trying to get across to people that the United States was getting jobbed. Okay, so you got jobs and you got job. Okay, like he made a point on saying the United States, basically gets getting jobbed by China and India because they're allowed to do certain things that the United States isn't. And that his method, is very interesting.
The interesting idea is that you mentioned it. This was an international agreement that only 2 other countries had stayed out of. But what else did you follow that up with? It's non-binding, and nobody has to really do anything regards it. So who cares?
Who cares?
We're not going to lose our position. Germany and Europe are not going to tell you, well, you know what, you pulled out of the Paris Accord. We're not going to share some intelligence with you. We're not going to be a good defense ally with you because you didn't do the Paris Accord with us. This shows a big difference between President Obama and the current President Trump. President Obama was guided more as a Eurocentric president. He thought, I got to go along, I got to give the Europe what they want because we want to be nice, we want everybody to like us. Right. The accord was not a bonus for the United States, and it wasn't a bonus even really for global warming. Or if everybody upheld to the Paris Accord, which is a big if, through the end of the century, it might drop global warming by 0.037 degrees, which is still, it dropped it. But the bigger effect on global warming is fracking in the United States and the development of natural gas, which will get us out of our coal usage, and we can then export that natural gas as well to other countries who are also
There's so much
using.
circular reasoning here. On the one hand, it's easy to achieve, and therefore achieving it wouldn't really hurt us. On the other hand, it would hurt us too much, so we should pull out. Let me just address a couple things here. Coal is on its way out because of the natural gas revolution, with the help of the Obama administration's mandates. Reversing that effectively, or trying to reverse it, rather than sort of nudging something along that was already underway, is going to prevent us from competing in other areas of energy that need to reach scale if we're going to compete with Germany and China on things like solar energy. There are states already where solar energy is the cheapest form of energy. And as you mentioned, of course, natural gas, which I admit, not everyone on the left agrees is a valid form of energy, but certainly President Obama did. So pragmatically speaking, these figures about it lower the temperature by this much or not, Trump threw something out like that today. I haven't totally fact-checked it, one of my colleagues is, but I get the impression that it might be a little fast and loose with the numbers. The fact of the matter is, if the United States wants to lead, not just with Europe, but also to bring China along, to bring developing nations along, just as everyone's crying foul about, then it needs to actually continue to lead. And China and India have made tremendous strides, and they're making enormous investments relative to their wealth that we would never even countenance.
I think believing that we were going to guide China along any path that isn't in best gear for
they're already shutting
China.
Down their coal plants at a faster rate. They're building hydroelectric dams.
Right.
They're making the real investments.
But
they're going to be the global leader.
But they have more coal burning plants than anybody else. So shutting down a few
they're
of them,
in a development
the older
stage
ones,
that's like us in the 1870s.
They're not going
and they've still leapfrogged us in terms of clean energy.
Okay.
Is there any difference in expectation based on where countries are at on the economic development timeline?
They've leapfrogged us in the form of clean energy.
All right, well, thank you. We're gonna have to move on. There's a lot of room for conversation on that topic for certain. Finally, German Chancellor Angela Merkel made headlines when she suggested that the U.S. is no longer a reliable partner to Europe. Here's Fox's news story.
In a speech last week to NATO, the president chided allies for failing to meet agreed-upon spending guidelines, that the 28 NATO members would spend at least 2% of the size of their economies on defense. Only 5 do so. President Trump also failed to explicitly mention the U.S. commitment to Article 5, a section of NATO's treaty stating an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all.
We have to know that we have to fight for our future and our fate ourselves as Europeans.
Okay, so Leif Larson with Kraft DC, what do you think really happened at this meeting?
Well, what happened is this is Chancellor Merkel wishing for the good days of her good buddy President Obama, arm in arm, Obama bending over backwards to help out the Europeans in any way that he possibly could to the benefit of them, usually at the expense of the United States. The United States is going to be a reliable partner for Europe and other countries in NATO, as the president said when they opened the new NATO buildings, and said in so many words that he was going to stand up and he respected the Article 5 self-defense. You know what is shocking, and with the German chancellor saying this, there's a new Harvard study out. 48%, only 48% of German citizens believe that they should come to the defense of other Europeans if attacked. The highest group of people who believe that are in the UK, Spain, and Portugal. Everybody else is below 50%. So saying the United States is not a reliable ally, they should look next door. Their own allies do not think that they should come to the defense of another country. And the other thing is, yes, there's a 2% mark for giving towards NATO that was set for 2024. Germany could meet that today, and so could most of the other members. They're not doing it because they know the U.S. will pick up the slack. The U.S. will send men and women over there to die if they need be, while they give universal health care and tax cuts and help out their own citizens by keeping back some of that money and spending it on their own people. This is all a Eurocentric idea that if the United States is not going to play our way, then they're not a good friend, and we're not going to be a doormat anymore.
Right. Yeah, I think Larson is right. That Angela Merkel was so used to dealing with President Obama, and he was a bit malleable when it comes to Europe, and he was much more Eurocentric, as Larson said, in regards to Trump. But she doesn't understand the sentiment, I think, in the United States.
The sentiment?
Yeah, the sentiment about what's happening. And I think Trump, is right in one respect. People in the United States, I'm talking regular citizens. I'm not talking about politicians. I'm not talking about the P word. I'm not talking about the P word. I'm talking about the C word, citizens. Folk are concerned about what's happening in the United States, not about NATO and Europe and Germany. Folk are concerned about the jobs. They're concerned about Donald Trump's budget proposal, you know, where so many things like after-school programs are getting cut, and this crazy situation with health care, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, do you really think that the people in this country are ready to go to war to help out Denmark, you know, if something happens?
All right, well, Daniel Marans, what's your take on this?
Yeah.
Well, the first thing that I just find funny is that, as usual, Trump can dish it and he can't take it. Here you have perhaps in some ways the second most powerful world leader effectively throwing him a little shade as a negotiating mechanism. I think that Donald Trump's just not used to leaders openly standing up to him, not just like Angela Merkel did, but like Emmanuel Macron did with the handshake, and then subsequently showed that he could do to Vladimir Putin. So look, yes, there is jostling over interests. I'm sympathetic, and I think President Obama was sympathetic to the idea that Europe should be paying its fair share. Whether that means you literally give them a middle finger to their face on their home turf, we'll see if that works out. I'm not particularly optimistic, but fine. I think that this question of Europe going it alone, in some ways, it is true. Maybe they should be picking up some of the slack, and frankly, Obama wanted them to do some of that. He wanted them to lead on Libya, and conservatives called that leading from behind. He wanted the Gulf nations to take care of Syria. Now, there are going to be outcomes to that reality that Americans don't necessarily like. I think Germany's made a mess, an absolute mess of the Eurozone, largely because it's too big and includes countries that don't belong in it. But then once some of those countries crashed, it sort of played a moralist card. So there are new realities to this withdrawalist foreign policy that President Obama encountered, and I think President Trump will encounter as well, even though he supposedly was running against that very same thing.
He does have a tendency to mix things up
and shake it up.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing was that members of the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they've already started building their defenses for themselves. Of course, because Finland borders on Russia. Without this reliance on NATO, and that's really what needs to be done. I mean, let's bear in mind NATO is over 50 years old and is reflective of a Europe after a destructive World War had ravaged the continent. Things have changed. Now, that's not things that we shouldn't say things have changed to the point where we should withdraw and let Europe deal on its own. We want to maintain a partnership, but it's no longer a Marshall Plan partnership. It's no longer the United States giving them everything they need to get back on their feet. Germany's well on its way and on its feet and is a competitor to the United States on a lot of things.
All right, now it's time to take some questions from our viewers. Ed Joseph, thank you for writing in. If there was a quid pro quo with Russia, what do you think the Russians were offering the Trump people? Who wants to take that one? Daniel, if there was a quid pro quo with Russia.
I must be the only liberal in Washington who is not enthralled by the Russia scandal. I'd rather be fighting on terms of policy.
So are you saying it's not that big of a deal?
I think that, no, I think it's potentially a very big deal just because the United States has done it to other countries in the past, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, just today, Russian President, or maybe it was yesterday, Russian President Vladimir Putin started to pull a little bit of a Crimea talk on it, where just like in Ukraine and the Russian incursion into the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, he initially said, no, those troops are not ours. Well, maybe there were little green men. Actually, that was definitely us. And here he sort of said, he's gone from categorically denying it to saying that, well, there may have been patriotic individual Russians who hacked the DNC and strategically leaked it rather than leaking the RNC's material. That would be the theoretical quid pro quo would have been the hacking and selective leaking of damaging Democratic emails. I'm sorry that answer was a little at the end there.
Yeah, that's okay. It came around. And this is from Michelle Glover. Why is the U.S. so invested in NATO at this point? Gregory.
Well, I think as we just talked about, there is a need for a organized European Western defense against aggression. I mean, nobody wants to see Russia move into the former Baltic states that it controlled through the use of power and military force. Nobody wants to see the disintegration of Ukraine as much as it already has, and even more. Nobody wants to see that. And so I think there's still a need for a joint military group, which has been very, very successful since its inception. Probably, I think, one of the longest lasting military treaty organizations. So I think it still serves a purpose today, but like in most treaties, things need to change according to the times.
Yeah, and you also needed, especially with what's happening in North Korea.
People do seem to be unified about North Korea.
Right. I mean, there's so many hot spots in the world. When you talk about North Korea, international terrorism, what's happening in Somalia and some of the other countries that are known to produce terrorists and commit terrorist acts. So you need it in that regard. I mean, we've seen that. I mean, look what happened in Manchester last week.
So there is some
natural
unification.
And it's very important to note for those who are not aware, who are watching this, that NATO came to the defense of the United States after 9/11 and served in Afghanistan.
Oh, thank you for that point. Okay, and now it's time for the most underreported story of the week. Who wants to start?
I'll go.
Okay.
LSU, also known as Louisiana State University. Their nickname is the Tigers. And in the continuum of student uprisings at colleges all across the United States in regards to tearing down whatever and getting rid of this statue or that statue and privilege, the students want the nickname Tigers and mascot banned. Why? Because they feel that Tigers is the word Tigers is a symbol of white supremacy. In terms of the Confederacy, during the Civil War, the Louisiana soldiers back during the Confederacy were called what? Tigers. That's the connection. Connect the dots. Crazy, but what can I say? College is crazy today anyway.
All right, Daniel Marans, Huffington Post.
Earlier this week, the campaign of Democrat Archie Parnell in South Carolina, he's running to fill the seat vacated by White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney. South Carolina's 5th. It's sort of a northern rural stretch of the state that includes some Columbia suburbs, some Charlotte suburbs. Parnell, the Democrat, is a former Goldman Sachs tax attorney, and his campaign released a poll conducted by a reputable Democratic-leaning polling firm, showing him down by just 10 points. Now, it is still extremely, extremely unlikely that he will win that seat, but it is a under-examined House special election race where Democrats have a chance to test their strategy of fighting every fight and having a 50-state strategy.
All right, and Leif Larson.
Well, I hope that stands clear, because I think the Republican down there should go beat up a reporter at some time. It worked in Montana.
Okay, well, you have now 20
No
seconds for you.
Not you, my friend, I swear. I would say another underrated reporter is something along the lines of yours. Evergreen College in...
All right, in a sentence, we've only got a few seconds left.
They wanted to start a day where all white students had to leave the campus, including professors. I don't know how that becomes into a free speech or lends itself to anything constructive, but there you go.
All right. Well, that's all for this week. I'm Heather Godwin, and thanks for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.